This House Resolution 758 was voted on today and it passed 411 to 10. It just shows you how corrupt and clueless our House of Representatives is. So I'm going to go through some highlights. But first, the difference between an HR bill and H-Res bill. So H-Res means it's a House simple resolution. It's not law. It can't go into law. It's not voted on by the other chamber, so the Senate. It does not have the force of law. So at least that's good. It's symbolic, but the symbols are just, you'll see they're upside down and completely bad. So the title of this travesty: strongly condemning the actions of the Russian Federation under President Vladimir Putin, which has carried out a policy of aggression against neighboring countries aimed at political and economic domination. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, just some of the more egregious. Whereas the Russian Federation has subjected Ukraine to a campaign of political, economic, and military aggression for the purpose of establishing its dominion over the country and progressively erasing its independence. The best way to do this is to just replace Russian Federation with United States. And then this would make sense. It's completely doublespeak, completely wrong. Okay, whereas the Russian Federation has provided military equipment, training, and other assistance to separatist and paramilitary forces in eastern Ukraine that has resulted in over 4,000 civilian deaths, hundreds of thousands of civilian refugees, and widespread destruction. The Western-backed government their attacks have resulted in 4,000 civilian deaths. The separatists aren't killing themselves. The refugees are the Eastern Ukrainians, driven there by the Kiev government. It's ridiculous. This might be my favorite one. Whereas November 2nd, 2014, separatist forces in eastern Ukraine held fraudulent and illegal elections in areas they controlled for the supposed purpose of choosing leaders of the illegitimate local political entities they have declared. You overthrew the democratically elected Ukrainian government and installed a Nazi puppet. And you're calling these elections fraudulent. Whereas Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, a civilian airliner, was destroyed by a Russian-made missile provided by the Russian Federation to separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, resulting in the loss of 298 innocent lives. I'm sorry. What? Aside from the fact that a Kiev fighter jet shot it down, the investigation isn't even complete yet. So how can you possibly declare that as fact? Whereas the United States has used and is continuing to use coercive economic measures, including the manipulation of energy prices and supplies, as well as trade restrictions, to place political and economic pressure on Ukraine. Also, we stole all their gold. Whereas the United States reaffirms its obligations under the North Atlantic Treaty, especially Article 5, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the treaty signatories shall be considered an attack against them all. Whereas the United States continues to conduct an aggressive propaganda effort in Ukraine in which false information is used to subvert the authority of the legitimate national government, undermine stability, promote ethnic dissension, and incite violence. Whereas the United States has expanded the presence of its state-sponsored media in national languages across Central and Western Europe with the intent of using news and information to distort public opinion and obscure American political and economic influence in Europe. And this one is saying that in order to combat Russian propaganda, we need more American propaganda. All right, so those are all the whereases. There's a whole bunch more. I couldn't put them all. So resolved that the House of Representatives strongly supports the efforts by President Poroshenko and the people of Ukraine to establish a lasting peace in their country. It includes the full withdrawal of Russian forces from its territory, full control of its international borders, and disarming of separatists and paramilitary forces in eastern Ukraine. The adoption of policies that reduce the ability of the Russian Federation to use energy exports and trade barriers as weapons, to apply economic and political pressure, and to end to interference by the Russian Federation in the internal affairs of Ukraine. and resolved to call on the Russian Federation to reverse its illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, to end its support of the separatist forces in Crimea, and to remove its military forces from that region. It doesn't say anything about their illegitimate elections either, but I'm sure we don't approve. Calls on the President to cooperate with United States allies and partners in Europe and other countries around the world to impose visa bans, target asset freezes, sectoral sanctions, and other measures on the Russian Federation. Calls on the President to provide the government of Ukraine with defense articles, services, and advice, it goes on to say. So let's give them. Calls on the President to provide the government of Ukraine with appropriate intelligence and other relevant information to assist the government of Ukraine to defend its territory and sovereignty. Calls on NATO allies and United States partners in Europe and other nations around the world to suspend all military cooperation with Russia, including prohibiting the sale to the Russian government of lethal and non-lethal military equipment. And if they were really our enemies in this New World Order, why would we be selling them lethal and non-lethal equipment now? Doesn't make any sense. Urges the President, in consultation with Congress, at least they put that in there, to conduct a review of the force posture, readiness, and responsibilities of United States Armed Forces and the forces of other members of NATO to determine if the contributions and actions of each are sufficient to meet the obligations of collective self-defense under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. And finally, after all this propaganda, we're calling for the reestablishment of a close and cooperative relationship between the people of the United States and the Russian people, based on the shared pursuit of democracy, human rights, and peace among all nations. This travesty passed 400 and, hold on, let me get the real numbers here, 411 to 10. At least it's not law. It's totally symbolic. But come on, are you kidding me? This is what goes on in our Congress.